The brown mare, pulling the empty buckboard, spooked at something only she could see, lurched hard to the left, and dragged the young stuntman straight into the split-rail fence 6 feet from where Dan Blocker stood. Notice this moment, because the choice Dan makes in the next 5 seconds will either save half a day of shooting or prove to every man on that dusty street that he meant what he said about never putting a scene above a person. The morning had started clean and bright, the kind of California day that made location shooting feel like a gift instead of a punishment. The ranch spread out in every direction, brown hills rolling toward a sky so blue it looked painted, the air carrying the smell of dry grass and sage. The crew had been setting up since dawn, positioning cameras and reflectors, and all the invisible machinery that turned empty land into television, their voices carrying across the open space. Dan had arrived early, as he always did, coffee in hand, already wearing most of his costume except for the hat, which he carried tucked under his arm, because he liked to feel the morning air on his head before the long day of takes began. The scene they were shooting was simple enough on paper. A buckboard wagon rolling down the main dirt road of the ranch, Dan standing nearby, having a conversation with another actor, the wagon passing behind them as background movement. Nothing complicated, nothing dangerous. The kind of shot they had done 100 times before, on 100 different episodes. But horses do not read scripts. Horses do not understand schedules, or budgets, or the invisible pressure that builds on every set as the sun moves across the sky. Horses live in a world of sounds and shadows and ancient instincts that no amount of training can fully erase. Instincts that can turn a calm animal into a terrified one in the space of a single heartbeat. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? And what time is it right now? Because what happened in the next few seconds is the kind of moment that separates the people who talk about values from the people who live them. The stuntman's name was Jimmy, 23 years old, new to the business but eager, the kind of young man who showed up early and stayed late and never complained about the dust or the heat or the long hours of waiting between shots. He had a wife at home, a small apartment in the valley, and dreams of working his way up to the kind of stuntman whose name people actually remembered. He had been hired to handle the wagon for this episode, a simple job that paid well and looked good on a resume. He was sitting in the driver's seat with the reins loose in his hands, waiting for the assistant director to call action, when the mayor decided she had seen enough. Nobody ever figured out what spooked her. Maybe a snake in the grass that no one else saw. Maybe a glint of light off a camera lens, catching her eye at the wrong angle. Maybe nothing at all. Just the accumulated tension of standing in the hot sun, while strangers moved around her with equipment she did not understand, and voices that meant nothing to her. Whatever it was, the mare went from calm to chaos in the space of a heartbeat. She reared slightly, then lunged sideways, and the wagon followed her, because that is what wagons do when horses decide to move. Jimmy tried to hold on. His hands tightened on the reins and his boots braced against the footboard. But the angle was wrong and the force was too sudden. The wagon tilted. The left wheel caught a rut in the dirt road, and suddenly Jimmy was not in the seat anymore. He was in the air, arms pinwheeling. Then he was on the ground with the breath knocked out of him. And then the wagon was still moving, and he was being dragged by one leg caught in the traces toward the split rail fence that marked the edge of the camera's frame. The sound of his body sliding through the dirt was loud enough to hear over the mare's panicked snorting. Look at Dan Blocker in this moment. He was standing maybe 6 feet away, close enough to feel the dust kicked up by the mare's hooves, close enough to hear the sound Jimmy made when he hit the ground. Most people, when something like this happens, freeze. The brain needs time to process what it is seeing, to sort through possible responses, to overcome the paralysis that comes from witnessing something sudden and violent. Most people lose 2 seconds, 3 seconds, sometimes more, standing still while their minds catch up with their eyes. Dan did not freeze. Dan moved. He covered those 6 feet in 2 strides, his boots digging into the dirt hard enough to leave marks, his arms already reaching for the traces that were dragging Jimmy toward the fence. The mare was still pulling, still panicked, her eyes rolling white, and her hooves churning the ground. But Dan got his hands on the leather straps and pulled back with everything he had. 270 pounds of man against 1,200 pounds of horse muscle and bone, and sheer stubborn will. That second was enough. Dan dropped to one knee beside Jimmy and worked the young man's boot free from the tangled traces. The leather was twisted around his ankle, tight enough to leave marks, but it came loose with one hard pull. Jimmy slid backward in the dirt, his face pale with shock, his hands shaking as they reached for his leg. The mare, freed from the resistance, bolted forward another 10 feet before a wrangler finally caught her bridle and brought her to a trembling stop, her flanks heaving and her coat dark with sweat. The wagon sat crooked in the road, one wheel still spinning slowly, dust settling around it like a curtain falling on a stage. The silence that followed was the kind that only comes after violence, heavy and waiting. Wait. Before we go any further, you need to understand the clock that was ticking underneath all of this. The production had exactly 4 hours of usable light left at this location. 4 hours to get 3 more scenes in the can before they had to pack up and move to the next setup. The assistant director had been checking his watch every 5 minutes since breakfast, calculating and recalculating the margins, trying to figure out how to squeeze everything into the shrinking window of daylight. Every minute lost was money spent. Every delay was a domino that would knock over other dominoes all the way down the line. The director was already walking toward them, his face tight, with the particular expression of a man who is doing math in his head and not liking the results. Behind him, the script supervisor clutched her pages, and the cinematographer stood frozen beside his camera, waiting to see what would happen next. Dan did not look at any of them. He was focused entirely on Jimmy, his large hands, gentle as they checked the young man's ankle for obvious damage. The boot had protected him from the worst of it, but there was already swelling visible above the leather, and Jimmy winced when Dan's fingers found the tender spot. "Can you move it?" Dan asked, his voice low and steady, the voice of a man who has seen injuries before and knows that panic helps no one. Jimmy tried. His foot rotated slowly, painfully, but it rotated, a good sign. Probably not broken, though only a doctor could say for sure. "I think so," Jimmy said. His voice was shaky, embarrassed, the voice of a young man who had just failed publicly at a job he desperately wanted to succeed at. "I'm sorry, Mr. Blocker. I should have held on better. I should have—" "Stop," Dan said. The word was firm but not harsh. "You don't apologize for a horse being a horse. That's not on you." Notice something about the way Dan was positioned. He had placed himself between Jimmy and the rest of the crew, his broad back blocking the young man from the eyes that were watching, giving him a moment of privacy to collect himself before he had to face anyone else. It was a small thing, the kind of thing most people would not even think to do, but it was the kind of small thing that told you everything you needed to know about who Dan Blocker was when nobody was keeping score. The director reached them. His name was Patterson, a veteran of dozens of television productions, a man who had learned long ago that sentiment was expensive and efficiency was everything. He had gray at his temples and lines around his eyes from too many years squinting into California sunlight, and he carried a clipboard that he never put down. He looked at Jimmy on the ground, looked at Dan kneeling beside him, and his jaw tightened in a way that everyone on set had learned to recognize. "How bad?" he asked. The question was directed at Dan, not at Jimmy, which told you something about who Patterson thought was in charge of this situation. "Bad enough that he's done for the day," Dan said. He stood up slowly, his knees protesting the sudden movement, and turned to face the director. "He needs to see a doctor. Someone should drive him into town." Patterson's eyes flicked to his watch. 3 hours and 45 minutes of light remaining. One stuntman down, A spooked horse that might or might not be usable for the rest of the day. The math was getting worse by the second. "We can get him looked at after we wrap," Patterson said. "If he can sit in the shade until—" "No." Dan's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of something that was not going to move. "He goes now. Someone drives him to the clinic, waits with him, brings him back when the doctor clears him. That's not negotiable." Listen to what just happened there. Dan Blocker was an actor, a hired performer. His job was to hit his marks and say his lines, and make the network happy. He did not have the authority to make medical decisions for the crew. He did not have the authority to override the director on matters of scheduling and logistics, but he did it anyway, standing in the dust of a ranch location with an injured stuntman behind him, and he did it in a way that left no room for argument. Patterson stared at him for a long moment. 3 hours and 20 minutes of light left, by his count. The clock in his head was ticking louder than ever. The two men had worked together for years, long enough to know each other's limits, long enough to have had this conversation before in different forms about different people. Patterson knew what he was looking at. He was looking at a line that Dan Blocker had drawn, and he was calculating whether it was worth the cost of trying to cross it. It was not. Patterson turned to his assistant director. "Get one of the PAs to drive him into town. Miller's Clinic on Main Street. Tell them to call us when they know something." The assistant director nodded and hurried away to make it happen. A production assistant appeared with a first aid kit, and another one brought a bottle of water. Someone helped Jimmy to his feet, 1 foot really, keeping his weight off the injured ankle, and guided him toward one of the trucks parked at the edge of the location. Dan watched them go, his eyes following the young stuntman until he was safely in the passenger seat with the door closed. Only then did he turn back to the director. "What do you need from me?" Patterson let out a breath. The anger that had been building in his face leaked away, replaced by something closer to resignation. He had lost this round, and he knew it, and there was no point in making it worse by holding a grudge. "We can shoot around the wagon for now. Get the dialogue scene in the can while we figure out what to do about the horse. You ready?" Dan nodded. He walked back to his mark, picked up the hat he had dropped when he ran toward Jimmy, and settled it on his head. The other actor was already in position, waiting, trying to pretend he had not just witnessed something that would be talked about for years in the quiet corners of craft services tables and wrap parties. "Ready when you are," Dan said. "Remember that clock I mentioned? The 4 hours of usable light?" They had already lost 15 minutes to the accident and its aftermath. 3 hours and 30 minutes remained, maybe less, if the clouds that were starting to gather on the horizon decided to move in faster than expected. But here is what happened over the next 3 hours. The crew worked faster than they had ever worked before, not because Patterson pushed them, though he did, not because the schedule demanded it, though it did. They worked faster because they had all just seen something that reminded them why they were here, what kind of show they were making, what kind of man was standing at the center of it. The dialogue scene went in 2 takes. 2 hours and 45 minutes of light remaining. The reaction shots that usually required 3 or 4 setups were done in 2 hours and 15 minutes. The background movement that would normally eat up half an hour of adjustments and repositions was locked in on the first try. Everyone was sharper, more focused, more present than they had been all week. The energy of the location had changed, shifted into something tighter and more purposeful, and it had changed because Dan Blocker had made a choice in the dust, and everyone had seen it, and everyone had felt it settle into their bones. Wait. Stop for a second. And picture this ranch from above. The brown hills rolling away in every direction. The dirt road cutting through the middle like a scar. The trucks and trailers clustered at one end. The camera equipment spread across the shooting area. The actors and crew moving through their carefully choreographed dance of setup and performance and reset. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, one large man in a cowboy costume, standing exactly where he was supposed to stand, saying exactly what he was supposed to say, but carrying something invisible with him that everyone could feel. That was the thing about Dan Blocker, that the cameras never quite captured. It was not just his size, though his size was considerable. It was not just his voice, though his voice could fill a room without trying. It was something else, something that lived in the space between his words and his actions, something that made people want to be better versions of themselves just because he was watching. The Wranglers got the mare calmed down eventually. 1 hour and 30 minutes of usable light remained on the clock. She was not injured, just spooked. And after an hour in the shade with water and quiet, she was ready to work again. They brought in a different stuntman to handle the wagon for the remaining shots, an older hand who had been working with horses since before television was invented. The scene got done. The schedule held, barely. And then, around 3 in the afternoon, with the light starting to soften, the PA's truck came bouncing back up the dirt road with Jimmy in the passenger seat. Dan saw it first, his eyes always watching edges. He was between takes, standing in the cool shade of an equipment truck, drinking water, and watching the clouds that were now definitely moving closer. He set down his water bottle and walked toward the truck before it had even come to a complete stop. Jimmy climbed out carefully, his ankle wrapped in a clean white bandage that stood out bright against the dust on his jeans, a pair of wooden crutches tucked under his arms. His face was still pale, but there was something else there too, something that looked like relief and embarrassment and gratitude all mixed together in equal measure. "Doc says it's a bad sprain," Jimmy said. "Not broken. I should be able to work again in a couple weeks." Dan nodded. He did not say anything about the schedule, about the time they had lost, about the complications that Jimmy's injury had caused. He just put a hand on the young man's shoulder and looked at him with those steady eyes that had made him famous. "You did good," Dan said. "You held on as long as you could. That's all anyone can ask." Notice the effect those words had on Jimmy. The tension in his shoulders loosened. The shame that had been sitting in his chest since the accident began to lift. He had been carrying the weight of failure around with him all afternoon, certain that his career was over before it had really begun, certain that everyone on this set would remember him as the stuntman who could not handle a simple wagon scene. And here was Dan Blocker, the star of the show, the man whose opinion mattered most, telling him that he had done good. That was the gift Dan gave people. Not just his time, though he gave that freely. Not just his attention, though he gave that too. He gave them permission to forgive themselves for being human. He gave them the dignity of being seen, not for their failures, but for their effort. He gave them the thing that everyone needs, and almost no one receives, the knowledge that someone who matters believes in them. The afternoon wore on. The clouds moved in, but held their reign, giving the crew just enough light to finish the last setup before the sky went gray. 45 minutes of light remained. When Patterson finally called wrap at 5:15, 30 minutes ahead of schedule, despite everything that had happened, the crew began the slow process of breaking down equipment, loading trucks, preparing for the drive back to the studio. Listen closely to what happened as the location emptied out. The grips and electricians passed by Dan one by one, nodding, some of them pausing to shake his hand or exchange a few words. The Wranglers who had dealt with the spooked mare stopped to thank him for giving them time to calm her down properly, instead of rushing them back to work. The script supervisor, who had been on more productions than she could count, told him quietly that she had never seen anyone handle a situation like that so well. Dan accepted all of it with the same easy grace he brought to everything. He did not puff up with pride or deflect with false modesty. He just nodded and smiled, and treated each person's gratitude as the simple human connection it was meant to be. But there was one more conversation waiting for him before the day was done. Patterson found him near the catering truck, eating a sandwich and watching the last of the equipment get loaded. "I owe you an apology," Patterson said. The words came out stiff, like they had been practiced on the drive over and still did not fit quite right in his mouth. Earlier with the kid, I was thinking about the schedule when I should have been thinking about the person. That was wrong. Dan finished chewing before he answered. He took his time, giving Patterson the space to sit with what he had just said. You were doing your job, Dan said finally. Schedules matter. Budgets matter. I know that. But people matter more. Patterson said it like a statement, but there was a question hiding underneath. Yeah, Dan said. People matter more, always. They stood there for a moment in the fading light. Two men who had just learned something about each other that they would not forget. Patterson had learned that there were lines Dan Blocker would not cross, no matter what the schedule demanded. And Dan had learned that Patterson was capable of admitting when he was wrong, which was rarer in this business than it should have been. Remember that choice I mentioned at the beginning? The one Dan made in those 5 seconds after the horse spooked? The choice that had cost them precious minutes when the clock was at 4 hours and counting? This is what that choice led to. Not just a stuntman getting medical attention when he needed it, not just a crew working harder because they had been reminded what mattered, but a conversation between two men at the end of a long day, a conversation that would change how Patterson ran his sets for years to come. That is the thing about choices, the small ones and the big ones. The ones that take 5 seconds, and the ones that take 5 years. They ripple outward, in ways you cannot predict, touching people you will never meet, changing situations you will never see. Dan Blocker understood this in his bones, in a way that most people only understand in theory. He knew that every choice was a seed, and that you never really knew what would grow from it, until long after it was planted. The drive back to the studio took an hour. Dan rode in one of the crew vans, squeezed into a seat that was too small for his frame, talking quietly with the makeup artist and the prop master about nothing in particular. The sun set behind the hills, and the sky turned orange, and then purple, and then dark. By the time they reached the studio lot, the stars were out, and the day felt like it had happened to someone else a long time ago. But Jimmy remembered, sitting in his apartment that night with his ankle elevated on a pillow, an ice pack. He thought about the moment Dan Blocker had stepped between him and the crew, blocking their eyes, giving him privacy. He thought about the words Dan had said, "You did good. You held on as long as you could." That's all anyone can ask. And somewhere in that memory, something shifted. The shame that had been threatening to swallow him began to dissolve, replaced by something that felt almost like gratitude. He had been seen. He had been helped. He had been treated like he mattered by someone who did not have to treat him like anything at all. 3 weeks later, Jimmy was back on set. Different episode, different scene, different horse, but the same Dan Blocker, standing in the same dust, wearing the same costume, carrying the same invisible weight that made everyone around him want to be better than they were. Dan saw him across the location and walked over. No fanfare, no announcement, just one man crossing a patch of dirt to talk to another. "Hankel holding up?" Dan asked. "Good as new," Jimmy said. And then, because he had been thinking about it for 3 weeks, and he did not know when he would get another chance. "Thank you, Mr. Blocker, for what you did that day. For stopping everything. For making them take me to the doctor. For..." Dan said, interrupting gently. "Just Dan. And you're welcome." He put a hand on Jimmy's shoulder, the same gesture he had used that first day, and for a moment, the two of them stood there in the morning light, connected by something that did not need words. Then the assistant director called for places, and Dan walked back to his mark. And the day began the way days always begin on a television set, with hope and chaos, and the belief that somehow, despite everything, the story would get told. If you want to hear what happened on the day the studio executives showed up unannounced, and Dan Blocker made a choice that nobody saw coming, tell me in the comments, Because this was not the only time he had to decide what kind of man he was going to be when the pressure was real and the stakes were high. There were other days, other moments, other people who needed someone to stand between them and the machinery that did not care whether they lived or died as long as the shot got done. And Dan was there, every single time, ready to move before anyone else, ready to put his body between the danger and the person who could not protect themselves, ready to remind everyone watching that the biggest man on any set does not have to be the one who throws his weight around. Sometimes the biggest man is the one who uses his weight to shield someone else. That was Dan Blocker. That was who he was. And that is why, decades later, people still tell stories about him. Not because he was famous, not because he was on television, but because he was brave when bravery was needed, and kind when kindness was rare, and human in all the ways that matter most when the cameras are not rolling and nobody is keeping score. The ranch location is gone now. The fences have been rebuilt and torn down a dozen times. The horses that worked there have long since passed to whatever reward awaits horses who spend their lives pretending to be part of the Old West. But the story remains. The moment remains. The image of one large man running through the dust, reaching for a young stuntman being dragged toward a fence, choosing to act when everyone else was still frozen. That is the inheritance Dan Blocker left behind. Not fame, which fades. Not fortune, which passes to others. Not the image on a screen that grows a little more distant with every passing year. But moments, choices, the memory of a man who decided again and again that people mattered more than schedules, and kindness mattered more than convenience, and doing the right thing mattered more than doing the easy thing. And maybe that is enough, and maybe that is everything that ever truly mattered in the end.